Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is, as always, happy whatever day it is. This is Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, I'm your host, and I'm going to be ranting away at you for the next roughly half hour or so, a little bit less. I'm going to be talking about things that I think are important enough for you to make note of. If you have any reactions to the show, as always, email them to me directly. This is my personal email, whoviating, whoviating @AOL.com. And if you didn't catch that, go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. The URL will be over here somewhere a couple of times during the show. You can go there, you can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, though, as always, I have two requests. One is to please include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is not spam, and two, be a little patient about getting an answer because I'm just terrible about answering email. All right, so with that, we're going to get on with it, and we're going to start, as by now is traditional, always trying to start with some good news. And this is good news, but it actually may be good news for a different reason than you initially think. It's about the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, I've talked about this thing a number of times before. Keystone XL is the pipeline that would bring tar sands, which are about the foulest, dirtiest, most polluting, most global warming creating way to get oil that there is. It would carry it from Canada across the central United States to refineries in Texas. And just as a reminder of what we're talking about, this is not a close-up of a smear of oil. That is an aerial photograph of an oil field, a tar sands oil field in Alberta, Canada. Now, the project has been held up by opposition from everyone from environmentalists to farmers and Native Americans living along the route of the pipeline. It's been subjected to various reviews, including a major one by the State Department, which is involved because the proposed route crosses an international boundary. Well, on November 2nd, TransCanada, the outfit that wants to build the pipeline, asked the State Department to halt indefinitely its ongoing review of the project. Now, initially, that might sound like good news, like when Shell Oil decided not to drill in the Arctic for the foreseeable future, that, in essence, the company was throwing in the towel. And the thing is, this is good news, but not for that reason. See, the company is not giving up. They're making a strategic move. See, the reason the company gave for asking for a delay is to wait until the review in Nebraska about the proposed pipeline route there is completed. But that review, the answer to that review, is not expected for 7 months to a year. So waiting until after that's finished would push any decision about the Keystone XL pipeline, any final decision, to well past the 2016 elections. Now, all the GOPR presidential candidates said that they are in favor of the pipeline. All the Democratic ones said that they are against it. Hillary Clinton got to that point rather late in the game, but she did get there, which is what's important now. But the point is here, in other words, what TransCanada is trying to do is to engage in a stall in order to keep the decision from being made until after a new administration comes into office in January 2017, which they're hoping will be a GOPR one. Okay, why is that good news then? Because it means the company has calculated that the Obama administration is likely to turn the project down. I've said on a couple of occasions that I think Obama is leaning toward rejecting the Keystone XL pipeline. He has, in fact, expressed skepticism about it, but that he is too worried about the possibility of offending some right-wingers, including right-wing Democrats, in the prairie states that the pipeline would cross. Apparently, TransCanada thinks the same thing about Obama's preferences here. And there are reasons to think that both the corporation and I are right about this. For one, the White House responded to TransCanada by saying the request to withdraw the permit was unusual and that it intends to continue the review with the idea that Obama will make a final decision before the end of his term. All of which means that the Keystone XL pipeline is on life support. It's not dead, and even if it's rejected, the company, TransCanada, could just try to start all over again with the new administration. But given all that, the fact is the project is still on life support. And that is good news. Next up, we have some updates about some things that I have talked about in the past, about a topic I've talked about in the past, but not so much recently. So it's actually about same-sex marriage and, in general, LGBTQ rights. And this time we actually have sort of an international flavor here. On October 22nd, as of October 22nd, the nation of Chile recognizes civil unions for same-sex and for opposite-sex couples. This is the result of a 4-year effort to get legislation like this passed. It was signed into law in April and went into effect 6 months later. This civil union allows some rights of marriage, including the right to make medical decisions on behalf of your partner if they're incapacitated, and to receive like pensions and survivor benefits. Now, this actually, again, this is the result of a battle, and the outcome was actually a compromise. Because even though these are not full marriages, obviously, there are signs that Chile is moving in that direction. For example, in January, when this bill was actually being debated, one of the houses, Chile has a bicameral legislature, and one of those houses actually passed a bill approving of same-sex marriage. The other house flatly rejected that. That's what led to the compromise for civil unions. So the thing is, Chile apparently is moving in that direction. In fact, polls indicate that as well. They actually said that a good portion of the people of Chile, at least close to half, actually support same-sex marriage. You can actually tell that South America is actually making strides in this. You can tell by looking at this map. You can see there that, yes, I know the map is in Spanish. You can figure it out, okay? Including the fact that the bar graph in the lower right, lower left actually, as you look at it, is actually represents the degree of support for same-sex marriage in various South American countries. Well, you notice that there are actually 2 countries that recognize same-sex marriage, 4 nations, Chile being one of them, that recognize some form of civil unions. And in fact, in one of those 4, Brazil, the country has actually approved same-sex marriage, but that matter is now on appeal in the Brazilian courts. So it's just right now for civil unions. These 6 nations together cover 80% of the population of South America. So things are moving in that direction. On the other hand, under the not good news heading comes the fact that Italy has just stripped away what limited recognition of civil unions it had. This all arose because some local officials in Italy, including the mayor of Rome, got tired of the central government's intransigence on the issue, and they started issuing, recording rather on the civil registries, recording marriages of people who were legally married, same-sex couples that were legally married outside Italy in places where those are recognized. The effect of recording that on the civil registry was to recognize these couples as married. There are about 100 couples, something over 100 couples, that this affected. Well, the right-wing government didn't like this idea, so they went to the courts. So a lower court said that, well, okay, but those marriages are valid unless the central government challenges one of those marriages. Got to do it on a case-by-case basis. The central government didn't like that decision either, so they appealed to the highest judicial court in Italy, and that court just last week overturned that lower court decision. They essentially said that the government is free to annul all of those marriages at a single swoop just by its own direction, which the government's going to do because that's what they wanted to do all along, which actually means that 100 couples which were married now suddenly aren't anymore. Now, again, this is coming at a time when opinion is moving in Italy. Even in Italy. Well, I should mention, too, before I forget, that the result of this court decision, Italy remains the only nation in mainland Europe without some form of recognition for same-sex couples. But even in Italy, things are changing. There was a recent poll that said that 51% of Italians would support same-sex marriage, and that 67%, two-thirds of them, approve of civil unions. So even in Italy, that is changing. But of course, the government there still has some time to catch up. But it still means there is some good news. So if we want flat-out bad news on this front, we have to come home. Where a recent case shows both the persistence of anti-LGBTQ discrimination and the need for federal action. In Missouri, a gay man named James Pittman was harassed by his boss and then fired over questions of his sexuality. He sued for discrimination and lost because the state Supreme Court found that Missouri's Human Rights Act does not cover sexual orientation. And the court refused to accept Pittman's argument that discrimination based on sexual orientation is, in fact, sex discrimination. In other words, in short, this decision reaffirms the fact that in Missouri, it is entirely legal to discriminate against homosexuals. Now, Missouri is hardly alone in this. Only 17 states and the District of Columbia have laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in employment, housing, and public accommodations. 5 more states have some limited version of those protections. But what that means is that 28 states have no explicit statewide protection for sexual orientation or gender identity. You can be harassed, you can be fired, you can be denied housing, you can be denied jobs, you can be denied public accommodations with impunity. Now, the EEOC, the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has found that both sexual orientation and gender identity are covered under existing federal provisions in the Civil Rights Act, but those were administrative law judgments, and so they are not legally binding on the courts, including those of Missouri. Worse news, in the sense of sadder news, comes out of Houston, the nation's 4th largest city, where a campaign of bigotry and lies has been successful in defeating a proposed city equal rights ordinance that would have extended legal protection against discrimination to 15 protected classes, including LGBT people. The city adopted the ordinance in May 2014, but it was held up by the reactionaries who sued and the amount of legal challenge to it, which ultimately was upheld by the equally right-wing Supreme Court of Texas, which ruled that for some still hard to decipher reason, the city could not pass this ordinance, but they had to put it up to a referendum. When the campaign for that referendum came, the bigots quickly latched onto the possibility that this would allow a transgender male, that is someone identified by male who identifies as, thinks of themselves as female, it would allow that person to use the women's restroom. They labeled it the bathroom bill, and the haters focused all their attention on the totally delusional but still useful images of male sexual predators going into the women's bathroom to molest girls. They focused attention on this to the point where a number of people thought that the ability of men to use the women's restroom was what the ordinance was about. By the way, as a quick sidebar that I think is something about revealing of the mindset involved here, no one seemed disturbed by the thought of a transgender woman using the men's room. Well, anyway, the point is supporters of this ordinance, as is all too often the case, proved incompetent at dealing with the kind of limbic system appeal of the right-wingers. Instead, they tried to run an upbeat campaign, and emphasizing on the protections that it offered and the fact that it was similar to ordinances in about 200 other cities, including some others in Texas. But the fact is, there is no way that such a, to use a slogan from a few years ago, reality-based campaign was going to counter ads and posters shouting, "No men in women's bathrooms." I said it when the Supreme Court declared bans on same-sex marriage to be unconstitutional. I said the fight is not over. And when one of these fights come up again, as they surely will, we have got to stop playing nice with the bigots. All right, another update. This one maybe even more serious. Okay, I said it last week. I said, quoting myself, "The Obama administration, the amazing Mr. O, our Nobel Peace Prize winning prez, is considering a direct combat role, boots on the ground, for U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria." I reported that, quoting myself again, his most senior national security advisors have recommended measures that would move U.S. troops closer to the front lines, including positioning some number of special operations forces on the ground in Syria. Well, just 2 days after I did that show, last Friday, it came to pass. The U.S., led by our peacenik residents, is going to deploy special operations forces into Kurdish-controlled areas in northern Syria, supposedly to coordinate, but perhaps also to protect the Kurds from more attacks by our supposed ally Turkey, which has pledged to take a more active role in battling ISIS, but has spent most of its time bombing the Kurds because they're afraid that if the Kurds manage to establish a foothold in northern Syria, it will increase demands for autonomy or even independence among the Kurds in Turkey. But the point I wanted to focus on here for now is the obvious one. These were special forces, U.S. troops, going into Syria. Boots on the ground in Syria, where they were never, ever going to be. This is so blatant a move that even the New York Times was obliged to call it a huge shift, quote unquote, in policy. But the White House continued with its bold-faced lying about what's going on, insisting it's just a small number of troops, while at the same time insisting they will be an important force multiplier that will have a real impact without having a combat mission. And if you can follow the logic of that, you can be a White House representative. And actually, you don't have to follow the logic. You just have to be able to say it with a straight face. Again, even the New York Times was moved to pointedly note that, quoting the paper, "The definition of combat has changed several times since the United States began airstrikes against the Islamic State in August 2014. In fact, the paper notes, special operations forces have already conducted several secret missions on the ground, including in Syria." In other words, what this means is that our leaders, the forces in the Pentagon and the White House, they have been lying to us about fighting on the ground. They are lying to us about fighting on the ground, and they will doubtless continue to lie to us about fighting on the ground for as long as they can get away with it, which is likely to be until some sufficiently large numbers of Americans have been killed that they can no longer be brushed off as accidents or isolated incidents or the results of individual acts of heroism by some soldier. But even so, despite that persistence, despite that insistence, the lies are fraying because they're becoming so obvious. Recently, White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest, saying something only a presidential press secretary could say with any facade of dignity because they actually have none, he asserted that sending special forces into Syria does not represent any change in strategy. And, swallowing whatever self-respect he had left, said that the troops in Syria don't have a combat mission, but they could be in combat situations. Which frankly strikes me like a burglar saying, I don't have a breaking and entering mission, but I could find myself in a breaking and entering situation. But in one sense, the strategy does remain the same. Not the military strategy, no, the domestic political strategy. The domestic political strategy of heading off any opposition that can't be brushed off as the product of right-wing rejection of anything and whatever Obama does. And doing it by making the U.S. role in the carnage as invisible, as seemingly sanitary as possible, as painless for us as possible. While the pain suffered by others, well, after all, they are others. there was some bitter humor to be found in all this. A senior defense official, quoted by CNN, said that Obama has approved a current cap of less than 50 troops in Syria, but more could be sent. So there is a cap, unless there isn't. Which shouldn't be a surprise, considering this president has already blown through limits on U.S. forces in Iraq, blown through the time frame for withdrawal from Afghanistan, and now has blown through the promise of no boots on the ground in Syria. It seems the only cap around here is the one on Donald Trump's head. Let's take a break. And we are back. Okay, let's take a moment out to laugh at some inanity. It is one of our regular features. It's time for the Clown Award, given as always for meritorious stupidity. The one of the big red nose this week is a repeat amuser, or repeat offender, as you will. Which means this week he gets not only the big red nose, he gets the size 20 floppy shoes. He is the man with the world's most perfect middle name, as he clearly has rocks in his head. Senator James Mountain, and yes, that really is his middle name, Senator James Mountain Inhofe. Now, you may know him by his other name, Senator Snowball, a name he earned after standing on the Senate floor in February with a snowball and tossing it to the presiding officer while claiming somehow that the fact that it snowed in Washington, D.C. in February was proof that global warming is a hoax. Well, Senator Rocks in his head is planning on hitting the road. Unfortunately, he's also planning on coming back. But he is planning on crashing the International Climate Conference in Paris in December, where some 190 nations are going to try to put some meat on the bare bones of past agreements to actually try to prevent catastrophic climate change. He says he wants to be the one-man truth squad and tell the truth that they're going to be lied to by the Obama administration. The lie apparently being that the U.S. is actually going to do anything about cutting its greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason is that it's a lie is because he and the other troglodytes in Congress will prevent anything from being done. And while they can't stop executive orders, those can be overturned by the next president, which, of course, preach it, brother, will be a gopper. Now, this is not the first time he's made this pilgrimage to be a beacon of truth. He showed up uninvited at the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009, where after spending some time stalking nearly empty halls, since he got there some hours before events were supposed to start for the day, his staff rounded up a couple of reporters to hear him rant that the hoax of climate change was based in the United Nations and the Hollywood elite. That led one reporter to ask him if he meant, at the time, Republican governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and another from the German daily Der Spiegel to say to him, "You're ridiculous." Inhofe then turned around and headed home without a single meeting with a delegate, even the U.S. one, yet apparently convinced he had succeeded in his mission of bringing to the conference the truth of guaranteed U.S. inaction. It's frankly really doubtful that he'll do any better this time. Which means, from another point of view, that he will actually succeed wildly, just as he did last time. Succeed wildly, that is, at being James Rocks in his head Inhofe clown. All right, but speaking of global warming, and I'll note again, as I do from time to time, that global warming and climate change, those things, they mean the same thing. They're exactly the same. But speaking of global warming, it's hard to not feel discouraged. Not that it's impossible to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change, but that sometimes it feels impossible to think that we'll actually do it, even as we tell ourselves that we're working as hard as we can. And in that fact lies the outrage of the week. Consider this. The United Nations has just drafted a report on an analysis of the intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs, of 146 countries. The INDCs represent the pledges those countries have made to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. The press report for this starts off with real happy talk. I'm going to quote this. "An unprecedented worldwide effort is underway to combat climate change, building confidence that nations can cost-effectively meet their stated objective of keeping a global temperature rise to under 2 degrees Celsius." 2 degrees Celsius is the level that most climate scientists agree is the upper limit if we're going to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Not that lower increases will not cause problems, they're already causing problems, but if we keep it below 2 degrees Celsius, we can probably manage. Well, it's not until the 9th graph of this press release that you read that the actual predictions for temperature increase by 2100 based on these commitments is actually 2.7 degrees Celsius, a third higher than the upper limit. And what's more, you read that these INDCs have the capability of limiting the forecast to 2.7 degrees Celsius. Now, what does that mean? It means that the overwhelming majority of the pledges to cut carbon emissions end in 2030. But if you assume that all of those nations make a commitment after that to keep reducing their carbon emissions after 2030 at the same rate they did before 2030, then you can keep it down to 2.7 degrees Celsius. If they don't, temperature increase could actually easily reach 3.5 degrees Celsius by 2100, which is disaster territory. This, in fact, comes at a time when a new study of high-resolution climate models says that without significant action by the end of this century, certain areas in the Persian Gulf may experience something that no one has experienced since the beginning of human civilization. Temperatures literally too hot for people to live in. Temperatures and humidity so high that even the healthiest people literally could not survive outdoors for more than a few hours, even in a shaded, well-ventilated area. And still the nations of this world, more particularly the industrialized nations, more particularly the rich nations of the world, hem and haw and stumble and make non-binding promises of some future action while the temperatures continue to edge up, and 2015 is on track to be the hottest year ever on record, breaking the old record set way back in 2014. Not that we can't do this. Just a month ago, I described new studies that showed how the United States and the entire world could go to essentially carbon-free, fully renewable energy-based economies by around 2050. We have the technology, we have the resources, we have the money. What we don't have is the will to challenge entrenched corporate interest and the interest in inconveniencing ourselves. And it's our children, and especially our grandchildren, who will pay the price for our hubris, our greed, our laziness, our selfishness, and our indifference. And that is an outrage. Very quickly, one last thing about global warming. There have been increasing calls for an investigation of Exxon Mobil for violations of RICO, the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organization Act, which makes it illegal to engage in fraud for financial gain. The tobacco companies were actually prosecuted under this, and there has been evidence released now that Exxon knew of the dangers of global warming back in the 1970s, but concealed that information, buried it, while publicly saying global warming is not a problem and privately, secretly financing the nanny-nanny naysayers on global warming. So now there is a big call to do this. That call actually got a leg up just a couple of days ago. Hillary Clinton said the DOJ should investigate Exxon because, yes, there's a lot of evidence they deceived people. Now, why is that important? Why is she important? Because if Hillary Clinton can endorse the idea, it's a real sign that this idea has gone mainstream. This is about as good as it can be. And even if Exxon doesn't face justice, which I frankly don't expect that it will, quite frankly, the fact that the knowledge that it lied about global warming is going mainstream, that sort of keeps up those fleeting hopes for an environmentally safe future. That's it for this week. We're out of here. Have the best week you can. Peace.